Twilight of Rome. Everything that is born in glory ends in shadow. The story of the Middle Ages begins right there, at that moment when Rome, the powerful, the eternal, the invincible, starts to crack like marble worn by the centuries. But it was not a sudden collapse. There was no single day when everything went dark and the world was covered in ruins. The end of the Western Roman Empire was more like a long agony, a slow-motion fall where emperors became increasingly fragile, armies less disciplined, and enemies bolder. It is in that twilight setting where our journey begins. For centuries, Rome had been the center of the known world. Its legions stretched from the scorching sands of the African desert to the mists of northern Britannia, and on its stone roads traveled ideas, goods, gods, and ambitions. But beneath that appearance of solidity, there was a machinery beginning to creak. As the empire grew, so did its weaknesses. The administration became more complex, taxes heavier, and the borders more difficult to defend. The 3rd century was a warning. Crisis after crisis shook the empire. Enemies outside, internal struggles within, inflation, plagues, civil wars, and constant pressure from the northern peoples began to form a pattern. The legions were no longer made up of Roman citizens with civic pride, but of foreign soldiers who fought more for pay than for loyalty. Emperors did not last long, some weeks, others days. The throne became an unstable seat and the imperial title a sentence. And yet Rome endured. Like an old wounded lion, it growled and clawed with what little it had left. In the year 285, the Emperor Diocletian made a radical decision. He divided the empire into 2 halves, an eastern and a western one. It was not a definitive break, at least not at that moment, but a desperate attempt to make it more manageable. Rome could no longer handle everything, so it shared the burden. Constantinople, a new and resplendent city on the shores of the Bosphorus, would be the capital of the East, while the West would continue to be ruled from the ancient Roman lands. The East prospered. It had commerce, culture, stability. The West, on the other hand, began to sink. The Germanic peoples, who for centuries had watched Roman splendor from the other side of the Rhine and the Danube, were becoming increasingly impatient. They did not just want to trade with Rome, they wanted their share of the spoils. Or even more, they wanted to live within the empire and some to rule it. The Huns appeared like a hurricane from the Asian steppes. Fierce, fast, relentless. Their arrival pushed the Germanic peoples toward the Roman borders. The Visigoths asked for refuge, but they were mistreated, exploited, and humiliated. It did not take long for them to rebel. In the year 378, the empire suffered one of its worst defeats at Adrianople. The Emperor Valens died on the battlefield, and for the first time, Rome discovered that its enemies were no longer just disorganized barbarians, but armies capable of defeating it. In the year 410, the city of Rome was sacked by the Visigoths of Alaric. It was a moral blow more than a strategic one, because by then, the capital was no longer the center of power. But even so, the news that the Eternal City had been taken by invaders resounded like thunder throughout the Roman world. It was as if the gods had abandoned their people. In the following decades, the map of the Western Empire filled with Germanic kingdoms. The Vandals crossed Hispania, entered North Africa, and took Carthage. The Ostrogoths settled in Italy. The Franks gained ground in Gaul. The empire no longer controlled its provinces. The emperors were decorative figures, puppets manipulated by generals or by barbarian leaders. Rome was still a powerful concept, but its body was being devoured from within. And thus we arrive at the year 476, a symbolic year full of historical weight. A Germanic general named Odoacer decided it was enough. He deposed the last emperor of the West, a teenage boy with an ironically grand name, Romulus Augustulus. There was no great battle. There was no blood, just a quiet transfer of power, like the closing of a door that had been creaking for centuries. That moment has traditionally been taken as the end of the Western Roman Empire and the beginning of the Middle Ages. But in reality, everything had started long before, and everything would continue long after. Because although the empire fell, its legacy did not disappear. The laws, the language, the roads, the cities, and above all the idea of a universal order remained alive. The Roman essence transformed. It mixed with the Germanic, the Christian, the rural. From that fusion, something new was born. And while the imperial throne vanished in the west, in the east, Constantinople endured. There, the empire remained alive and strong, with emperors who still called themselves Romans. In a certain sense, Rome did not die. It only changed form. It slid into something different, less uniform, more chaotic, but full of possibilities. That is the seed of the Middle Ages. It is not born from a void, but from the slow collapse of a giant. What begins with the fall of Rome is not only an ending, it is the opening of a fascinating era in which kingdoms will rise over ruins and light and shadow will dance together for 1,000 years. And in that new world that is opening up, where kings are warriors and bishops wield swords, where faith guides empires and the fear of the unknown writes the rules, the foundations begin to form for what, centuries later, we will call Europe. We now delve into that world in the making, where the Germanic kingdoms trace the first lines of a new order that is no longer Roman, but not entirely foreign either. Because if Rome fell, its echoes still resound, and the medieval world is about to be born. The Germanic kingdoms and the new order. The dust still floated in the air after the collapse of Rome, but men did not wait for it to settle before beginning to draw a new world upon the remains of the old one. From the lands of the north and the east came peoples who for centuries had been seen as barbarians through the haughty gaze of the empire. Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Franks, Vandals, Burgundians, Suebi, Alemanni. All of them, different in language, customs, and mythology, shared something essential: a deep yearning to claim a place in the lands that once belonged to the Roman giant. These Germanic peoples, far from merely pillaging and destroying, began to establish their own kingdoms, to organize territories, to forge alliances, and also, little by little, to adopt elements of the Roman culture that fascinated them as much as it felt foreign to them. Thus, in the midst of confusion, a new form of civilization was born, hybrid, tense, unpredictable, but vibrant. The old provinces of the empire were filled with new rulers who spoke different languages, worshipped strange or newly discovered gods, and saw themselves as owners of lands they once only dared to touch as invaders. One of the first to understand the scope of this change was the Visigothic king Alaric, the same man who had sacked Rome in the year 410. Although his action was perceived as a brutal act, behind his sword was a clear strategy. The Visigoths wanted land to settle, not just loot. They did not aspire to destroy the empire, but to integrate into it as a legitimate part. After his death, his people ended up establishing a kingdom in Gaul, and later in the Iberian Peninsula, where they would form a lasting power with its capital in Toledo, a city that went from being a Roman settlement to becoming one of the most important centers of the new Germanic order. The Ostrogoths, close relatives of the Visigoths, did the same in Italy. Their leader, Theodoric the Great, had been raised in Constantinople and understood both the language of the Romans and the roughness of his own people. When he took control of the Italian peninsula, far from devastating it, he tried to preserve its administrative structure and to maintain a coexistence between Romans and Goths. Although it was not a perfect integration, the effort marked a peculiar era, where the toga of the Roman official coexisted with the curved sword of the Germanic warrior. Meanwhile, in the north of Gaul, one of the kingdoms that would change the course of Europe was emerging: the kingdom of the Franks. Unlike other Germanic peoples who remained Arian, a variant of Christianity considered heretical by the Church of Rome, the Franks, under the leadership of Clovis, adopted Nicene Christianity, the same faith professed by the Latin bishops. This act, which might seem like a simple gesture of faith, was in fact a highly intelligent political move. By embracing the religion of the Latin majority, Clovis earned the support of the Church and made it easier to unify his subjects, both Frankish and Roman, under a common symbol. The Franks expanded their kingdom rapidly, and their alliance with Christianity gave them a decisive advantage over other Germanic kingdoms. Clovis founded the Merovingian dynasty, which would rule for more than 2 centuries, although it would eventually lose real power to the so-called mayors of the palace, an administrative figure that, over time, would become more powerful than the king himself. The most famous of these mayors was Charles Martel, grandfather of Charlemagne, whose story we will explore later. Other Germanic kingdoms had more ephemeral, yet no less significant trajectories. The Vandals, for example, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and founded a kingdom in North Africa, from where they went on to sack Rome for a second time in the year 455. Their maritime dominance and their persecution of Catholic Christians gave them a bad reputation among the chroniclers of the time, although their administration was notably efficient for several decades. In the Iberian Peninsula, in addition to the Visigoths, other peoples such as the Suebi and the Alans left their mark in regions like Galicia and Lusitania, although they ended up being absorbed or displaced by the Goths as they consolidated the Hispanic kingdom. The multiplicity of peoples, languages, and customs made Hispania a sort of laboratory of coexistence and conflict, where the Roman legacy filtered into the new structures, but was also modified by the Germanic worldview. One fascinating aspect of this era is how the Germanic kingdoms began to copy elements of Rome while rejecting its centralism. The kings did not proclaim themselves emperors, nor did they try to rebuild the empire, but they did adopt its administration, its laws, its language, and even its architecture. Roman roads were preserved, aqueducts were respected, and in many cases, the same public buildings were reused, now turned into fortresses, palaces, or churches. At the same time, their own legal codes emerged, such as the Liber Judiciorum of the Visigoths, which mixed Roman law with Germanic customs. The law thus became a tool of integration, but also of control. It was no longer applied based on citizenship, as in Rome, but according to ethnic belonging. There were laws for Goths and laws for Hispano-Romans, and for a long time, both coexisted without fully merging. Religion played a crucial role in this new configuration of power. Christianity, which had once been persecuted by Roman emperors, became the element that built bridges between different peoples. The Church, with its network of bishops, monasteries, and schools, was transformed into the great mediator between the Germanic kingdoms and the Latin population. In many cases, it was the only institution that maintained real continuity with the imperial past, which gave it enormous symbolic weight. Converting to Orthodox Christianity was not only an act of faith, but also a way to gain legitimacy in the eyes of the population and, above all, of the clergy. In this context, the concept of kingship changed profoundly. It was no longer enough to be the chief of a tribe or the bravest among warriors. Now kings presented themselves as chosen by God, bearers of a sacred mandate, heirs of a tradition that came from biblical times, but that also aspired to preserve something of Roman splendor. The crown became a symbol of dual authority, earthly and spiritual. The world that was emerging was fragmented, unstable, full of tensions and conflicts, but also fertile in ideas, in adaptations, in exchanges. The notion of empire, though weakened, had not completely disappeared. It lived on in coins, in laws, in the liturgy of the church, and in the hearts of many rulers, the hope of someday restoring that lost unity remained alive. Thus, through pacts, battles, conversions, and marriages, the tapestry of what would become medieval Europe was woven. A continent that was no longer Roman, but that had not ceased to be so entirely. The Middle Ages was beginning to take shape, and the Germanic kingdoms would be its first architects. And now, crossing the Adriatic Sea, we head toward the empire that did not fall, the one that survived the collapse of the West and kept the Roman flame alive for centuries. In the next chapter, we will step through the golden gates of Constantinople to discover the splendor of Byzantium. Byzantium, the empire that did not fall. While the Germanic kingdoms were weaving their place among ruins and raids, while the former provinces of the Western Roman Empire were fragmenting under new flags and crowns of warriors newly made kings, on the other side of the Adriatic Sea, on a peninsula where Asia and Europe shake hands, an empire remained alive. An empire that did not fall, that resisted, transformed, and wrote its own story, often apart from what was happening in the medieval West. We are talking about Byzantium, or as they preferred to call themselves, simply Romans. Constantinople was their capital, and it was not just any city. Founded by Emperor Constantine on the site of the ancient Greek colony of Byzantium, it rose in a strategic location, guarding the Bosphorus Strait, dominating the passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. There, the trade routes of East and West converged, from the steppes and the desert, from fallen empires and kingdoms yet to come. Its triple wall seemed impenetrable, its fleet was feared, and its wealth dazzled both ambassadors and invaders. Unlike Rome, Constantinople was alive, active, defiant, and its empire was not only surviving, it was reinventing itself. The Eastern Roman Empire, direct heir to the eastern half of the empire divided by Diocletian in the 3rd century, did not see the year 476 as an ending, but merely another milestone in a long chain of upheavals. For them, the fall of the Western Empire was a distant catastrophe, a tragedy that occurred far away in the barbarian provinces. In Byzantium, emperors continued to be crowned. Coins continued to be minted with the effigy of the basileus. Laws were still issued in the name of Rome, and the armies, though very different from the old ones, were still organized under structures inherited from consuls and legionaries. And then, in the 6th century, the figure of an ambitious, brilliant, and tenacious emperor emerged, whose shadow would stretch over European history for centuries: Justinian. He ascended to the throne in the year 527 and quickly made it clear that he would not be content merely managing what was left of the Eastern Empire. His dream was vaster, more daring, to restore the unity of the ancient Roman Empire. For that, he needed to reconquer the West. And he tried. Through his general Belisarius, one of the most formidable strategists in history, Justinian launched a series of military campaigns that recovered immense territories. North Africa was taken from the Vandals. Italy was reclaimed after brutal battles against the Ostrogoths, and part of the Iberian Peninsula fell under imperial control. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though Rome was resurrecting from the east, that the imperial dream was being woven anew. But reality soon revealed its sharp edge. The wars had cost too much, the recovered regions were devastated, and the plague, arriving from Byzantine Egypt, decimated the population of Constantinople and the entire empire with such brutal virulence that some believed the end of the world had come. And yet, amid ruins and disease, Justinian left an indelible mark. His legacy is measured not only in battles, but also in law and architecture. During his reign, the monumental Corpus Juris Civilis was compiled, a work that not only preserved Roman law but reorganized it in a way that would influence European legislation for over 1,000 years. In the heart of his capital, he also ordered the construction of one of the most astonishing jewels of universal architecture, the Hagia Sophia Basilica. That immense dome suspended over marble columns with its golden mosaics and its echo of eternity was not just a church. It was a declaration of power, faith, and splendor. Byzantium was not Rome, and yet it deeply was. Its language was no longer Latin, but Greek. Its culture was steeped in Hellenistic heritage, Eastern thought, and Orthodox Christianity. The figure of the emperor became surrounded by almost sacred ceremonial, where politics and religion intertwined in solemn rituals, wrapped in gold, incense, and liturgical chant. The Byzantine court was a world of its own, sophisticated to the extreme, full of intrigue, poisoned diplomacy, and an aesthetic that both fascinated and unsettled in equal measure. And while the West sank into a convulsive Middle Ages marked by fragmentation, feudalism, and isolation, Byzantium maintained constant relations with Persia, with the Slavic peoples, with the Arabs, with the Chinese. It was a commercial hub, a source of knowledge, a cultural intermediary between worlds that barely sensed each other's existence. Its monasteries preserved ancient texts, its artists perfected the mosaic, its music filled Orthodox churches with harmonies that seemed to spring from the divine. But nothing was eternal, and Byzantium knew it. Starting in the 7th century, the world changed again. Islam emerged in Arabia with unimaginable strength and expanded at a pace that left many paralyzed. Arab armies conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa. Entire cities that had once belonged to the empire passed into the hands of the caliphate. Constantinople held its ground, thanks in part to Greek fire, an incendiary substance that could burn even on water, and became one of the most feared military secrets of the medieval world. The empire contracted, but it did not disappear. It reorganized. And over the following centuries, despite invasions, heresies, internal divisions, and new threats looming over Europe, Byzantium endured. In the 9th century, the Macedonian emperors led a kind of cultural renaissance. Schools filled with manuscripts, artists once again adorned churches, and Byzantine diplomacy wove subtle pacts with peoples who had once been enemies. It was a world that did not surrender easily. It was flexible, shrewd, patient, sometimes fragile, other times lethal. For centuries, Western Europeans viewed Byzantium with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. They saw it as part of their heritage, yet perceived it as too Eastern, too enigmatic. The Crusaders, centuries later, would go so far as to sack Constantinople with a brutality even the Muslims had not matched. But that is a story yet to be told. For now, let us remain with this image, an empire that, while the world around it changed its shape, its faith, and its language, resisted, adapting, withdrawing, shining in the shadows like an oil lamp refusing to go out. An empire that guarded what remained of Rome, but also transformed it, reinterpreted it, and offered it to the future with an elegance few understood in its time. Byzantium is the great missing piece in many medieval narratives, and yet without it, Europe would not have become what it was. It would not have had bridges between East and West. It would not have inherited many classical texts. It would not have known art, science, and diplomacy in their most refined forms. And while Constantinople shone in the East like a resilient jewel defying the passage of centuries, a different force was taking shape in the rest of Europe. The Church, which not only survived the chaos, but began to extend its roots into every corner of the continent. In the next chapter, we will see how Christianity was not only a faith, but a structure of power that would shape the medieval destiny. The Church, pillar of the medieval world. when the sound of swords faded, when the cities lay in ruins, when roads became unsafe and armies changed their banners as if power were a game of dice, there was one institution that not only remained standing, but grew stronger with each crisis: the Church. In a world that seemed to be falling apart, in a Europe that was constantly fragmenting, the figure of the bishop, the silhouette of a monastery, or the deep voice of a liturgical psalm were signs of stability, of permanence, of an order rising above the chaos. The Christian Church was not a passive actor in this period. Since the final centuries of the Roman Empire, it had skillfully woven its influence into every level of society. When Rome fell in the 5th century, the papacy already existed. Councils had established fundamental doctrines, and Christianity had spread across nearly all of Europe. But in the following centuries, that spiritual body also became a political, economic, intellectual, and cultural network without parallel. The Bishop of Rome, known as the Pope, went from being a theologically relevant figure to becoming a central authority for Western Christianity. He was no longer just the heir of Peter, the fisherman to whom Christ, according to the Gospels, had given the keys to the kingdom of heaven, but a leader who stood up to kings, signed treaties, organized crusades, and excommunicated the powerful. His power did not come from the sword, but from something even more feared: eternal damnation. And in a world where life was fragile, where plague, hunger, and war were common companions, the salvation of the soul weighed more than any imperial decree. Churches, built over ancient temples or raised in the middle of desolate fields, became centers of life. They were not just spaces for prayer, but places for gathering, for refuge, for justice. The priest was often the only person in a village who could read and write. The nearest monastery might be the only place where books were copied, where Latin was taught, where the memory of the ancient world survived letter by letter, illuminated with ink and gold on parchment. The monks, hooded and silent, were guardians of knowledge. In places such as Monte Cassino, Cluny, or Fulda, the scriptoriums vibrated with constant activity. There, texts by Aristotle, Cicero, the fathers of the church, and ancient chroniclers were copied by hand with almost obsessive precision. In times when forgetfulness was the norm, when a simple invasion could erase the history of entire generations, the act of copying a book was a gesture of resistance, of continuity. But the church did not remain locked behind its walls. It went out, evangelized, negotiated. Missionaries crossed valleys, climbed mountains, entered territories ruled by pagans, and spoke of one God, of a redeeming sacrifice, of a life beyond death. Christianity managed to take root among Germanic, Slavic, Celtic, and Scandinavian peoples, not only because of its message, but because of its capacity to adapt, to take former symbols and give them new meaning. Where once a Druidic stone stood, now a cross was erected. Where there had been a sacred forest, a hermitage now rose. In this way, the church became woven into the European geography, like a second skin covering fields, towns, and cities. The ecclesiastical hierarchy in some ways mirrored that of the ancient empire. Bishops were almost like lords, with lands, servants, and power over wide territories. The archbishop organized councils, corrected heresies, and advised kings. And the pope, in Rome, sent legates, blessed coronations, and at times openly opposed monarchs when he believed his spiritual authority was being ignored. The relationship between the church and political power was complex, often conflictive, but always intertwined. A king needed to be anointed by a bishop to be considered legitimate. A war without papal blessing could be seen as illegitimate, even as a rebellion against God. And the most powerful monasteries owned lands equivalent to those of a feudal lord, with peasants who worked for them, with harvests, markets, and toll rights. The church also became one of the great bankers of the Middle Ages. Through the tithe, it collected 1/10 of each Christian's harvest and income. Through indulgences, it received money in exchange for promises of redemption. And through donations from nobles fearful of divine judgment, it accumulated properties, fortresses, jewels, and relics. That material wealth was mixed with an even more powerful symbolic wealth, that of knowledge, of ritual, of mystery. Inside churches, Latin was spoken, ancient psalms were sung, incense was burned, and gestures were performed that connected the human with the divine. Baptism, marriage, extreme unction. Every moment of life was marked by a sacrament. From birth to death, the soul of a medieval man was under the church's care. It was a constant presence, not only on Sundays, but every day, every night, in every fear, in every hope. And when discordant voices arose, when someone questioned orthodoxy, the church knew how to respond. Councils emerged, theological disputes, heated debates in cloisters. Heresy was not just a doctrinal error, it was a threat to the order, and sometimes that threat was fought with preaching, other times with fire. The Inquisition had not yet been born in these early centuries, but a need for vigilance, for correction, was already taking shape. Christianity had to be one, had to speak with a single voice. Pluralism, in an age without printing or media diversity, was seen as an existential danger. Despite all this, or perhaps because of it, the church was also a space for the sublime. Medieval spirituality was deep, complex, and often beautiful. From the Confessions of St. Augustine to the mystical visions of Hildegard of Bingen, from the poetry of hymns to the construction of the first Romanesque cathedrals, the soul of medieval Christianity was not only dogmatic, it was also sensitive, capable of moving, of elevating, of offering comfort in hard times. Thus, in the deep fabric of the medieval world, the church was not just another actor. It was the framework. It was the foundation upon which kingdoms were built, laws were written, dreams of salvation were raised, and also the fears of hell. Its influence reached the heart of every village and the halls of every palace. It was the voice that murmured at funerals, the bell that marked the hours, the chant that filled the valleys at dawn. And its power had only just begun. Because in the centuries to come, the church would face new challenges: Islam, the rebirth of empires, the Crusades, heresies, science, the printing press. But before all that, a new religion was emerging in the desert, lighting a flame that would illuminate and challenge the Christian world for centuries. Up next, we will cross the sands of Arabia to witness the rise of Islam, one of the most intense spiritual and political revolutions in human history. Muhammad and the flame of Islam. While Europe was emerging from the ruins of Rome, among Germanic kings and Latin clerics weaving the new age from remnants of the old world, a silent fire began to ignite in the vast, scorched sands of the Arabian Peninsula. It did not arise from an empire or a dynasty, but from an orphaned, meditative, and solitary merchant who heard a voice in the shadows of a cave. What began as a whisper would soon change the destiny of the world. His name was Muhammad. His message was Islam. In those years of the 7th century, Mecca was a bustling and dusty city at the heart of the desert. Its wealth came from caravans, from trade between Yemen, Syria, and the Red Sea. But its importance went beyond commerce. It was a religious center, where multiple gods and tribal spirits were venerated, and where the Kaaba, that austere, cubic structure, already stood as a sanctuary of ancestral worship. Each tribe had its representation there, and the chiefs guarded their idols as symbols of power and legitimacy. In that polytheistic environment, marked by oral tradition, improvised poetry, harsh climate, and unbreakable loyalty to the clan, a 40-year-old man from the clan of the Hashemites, a merchant by trade, began to proclaim that he had received messages from a single God, an invisible, eternal God, the creator of the universe. He said that the angel Gabriel had transmitted to him the first words of a revelation that would continue for more than 2 decades. Those words, vibrant, sharp, memorable, would form the Quran, the sacred book of Islam. At first, the reaction was contempt, mockery, and then persecution. Muhammad was not offering reform. He was offering rupture. His message challenged the tribal order, the privileges of the powerful, and commercial practices based on excessive interest. He spoke of justice, compassion, and final judgment. He said that lineage and wealth did not matter, that what counted in the eyes of God was faith, actions, and the sincerity of the heart. For the dominant clans, this was a direct attack. They expelled him, threatened him, tried to silence him. But it was already too late. In the year 622, Muhammad and his followers undertook a crucial journey, the Hijra. They left Mecca and settled in Medina, where the message was received with hope and where, for the first time, he was able to organize a community under new spiritual and social principles. The Hijra was not just a move. It was the birth of a new way of understanding power, law, and coexistence. Since then, the Islamic calendar begins with that year as a symbol of refounding. In Medina, Muhammad was a prophet, but also a judge, diplomat, and strategist. His figure combined the roles that in the West were divided among the king, the priest, and the lawmaker. He organized a city divided by years of tribal disputes, established rules that regulated trade, charity, prayer, fasting, and war. Daily life was woven with threads of spirituality. Every gesture had meaning. Every act was seen as part of a totality that connected the believer with the absolute, and the message grew. It expanded beyond the walls of Medina, winning hearts and also provoking distrust. The tensions with Mecca turned into open conflict. There were battles, negotiations, broken truces. But after a few years, Muhammad returned to his native city, not as a persecuted man, but as a leader. He entered Mecca without bloodshed, purified the Kaaba of idols, and consecrated it to the worship of the one God. From that moment on, Islam ceased to be a persecuted sect and became a civilization in motion. When Muhammad died in the year 632, he left behind not a static book or a scattered group, but a solid, organized movement with astonishing expansive force. His followers, driven by an intense and universal religious vision, began an expansion unlike any previous conquest. It was a mixture of spiritual fervor, political pragmatism, and intellectual openness. In just a few decades, Islam had spread throughout the Middle East, crossed North Africa, reached Persia, and pushed its frontiers toward the Iberian Peninsula in the west and toward India in the east. This new world was not simply a continuation of the previous one. It was a synthesis. Wherever Muslims settled, they did not erase everything that existed. They incorporated it. They made use of Greek knowledge preserved in Syria and Egypt, the agricultural techniques of Mesopotamia, the administrative systems inherited from the Persians. They built cities like Baghdad, which became a beacon of science, art, and philosophy. They translated Aristotle, debated Plato, and developed medicine, astronomy, and geography. Medieval Islam was a spiritual power, yes, but also a civilization of knowledge, of books, of universities, and of long-distance trade. Mosques, with their tall minarets and delicate domes, rose in every newly conquered city. The walls were filled with sacred calligraphy. The image of God or the prophet was never represented, but the word, the sign, and the sound were beautified. In Cordoba, Damascus, Cairo, and Samarkand, libraries emerged where manuscripts from all peoples were gathered. A network of knowledge was woven that united the Atlantic with the Indus. While Western Europe endured dark centuries, divided among small kingdoms and endless wars, the Islamic world offered secure trade routes, efficient postal networks, stable currencies, and relative tolerance toward Jews and Christians, who were considered people of the book. Although legal discrimination existed, many of these groups found more protection and stability in Islamic cities than in certain Christian kingdoms, where persecution was constant. Islam was not just a religion, it was a worldview. It organized daily life, defined justice, economics, and art. Prayer 5 times a day marked the rhythm of the hours. Fasting during the month of Ramadan reminded believers of their fragility and dependence on the divine. The pilgrimage to Mecca, which every Muslim was expected to undertake at least once in their life if they had the means, symbolized the unity of the community, the Ummah, beyond ethnicities, languages, and borders. And yet not everything was harmony. Internal divisions soon arose. The death of Muhammad without a clear heir gave rise to disputes that would mark Islam forever. The split between Sunnis and Shiites began in those early days, when some supported the selection of Abu Bakr as caliph, while others insisted that leadership should remain with Ali, and by extension, his lineage. This fracture, political more than doctrinal in its origin, deepened over the years, leading to conflicts, wars, and parallel narratives within the same faith. Despite this, the initial impulse was unstoppable. Islam became one of the most powerful actors of the medieval world, capable of dialoguing with Byzantium, challenging Christian kingdoms, and building bridges, and also walls between East and West. Europe cannot be understood without the impact of this new faith that had emerged from the desert without an army, without temples, without territory. But with words so powerful they still echo through the corridors of history. And while Islam illuminated its cities with oil lamps, perfumed manuscripts, and turquoise ceramic domes, in Western Europe, a man would raise an empire with sword, cross, and crown, believing he could restore the old Roman and Christian order. A titanic dream that would shape the fate of the continent. Charlemagne and the Carolingian dream. Amid a Europe still marked by the ashes of the Roman Empire and the expansion of a faith that permeated everything, a figure emerged who not only rode across battlefields, but also sought to reunite what had been scattered, to raise what had fallen, and to revive the echo of Rome in a world that had already changed. His name was Charles, although history would remember him by a title that resounded with force. Charlemagne, King of the Franks, Emperor of the reborn West, architect of a dream that, although brief, left such a deep mark that centuries later it would still be invoked as the ideal of Europe. The rise of Charlemagne was not an accident, nor a sudden leap, but the result of a dynasty that had already been shaping the destiny of the Frankish kingdom. His grandfather, Charles Martel, had saved Western Europe from the Muslim advance by stopping the Islamic armies at the Battle of Poitiers, and his father, Pepin the Short, had taken the crucial step of establishing the legitimacy of their lineage by being anointed as king by the Pope himself. That gesture sealed an alliance that would change medieval politics, the throne and the altar walking together, reinforcing one another. Charlemagne inherited a strong but fragmented kingdom, still populated by restless tribes, with regions where loyalty to the king was more a formality than a tangible reality. He soon understood that power needed to be asserted firmly, and he did so with determination. His military campaigns were relentless, extensive, and at times ruthless. He fought against the Lombards in Italy, against the Saracens in the Iberian Peninsula, against the Bavarians, the Avars, and above all, against the Saxons. A long and bloody war that lasted more than 30 years. It was not just about conquest, but about subjecting peoples who still practiced pagan rites to Christian order, peoples who offered sacrifices to ancient gods and fiercely defied the message of the gospel. As his armies advanced, so did the cross. Conversion was not always a peaceful act. There were forced baptisms, destruction of pagan temples, mass executions such as those in Verdun, where thousands of Saxons were killed after rebelling. Charlemagne believed that a Christian empire needed spiritual cohesion, that faith could not be fragmented. Each church built was a sign of conquest, but also another brick in the architecture of his imperial vision. However, Charlemagne was not only a conqueror. He had a broader vision, a deep awareness of the value of knowledge, of art, of administrative order. During his reign, he promoted what historians would later call the Carolingian Renaissance, a deliberate effort to recover the cultural heritage of Rome, to encourage the study of Latin, to copy ancient manuscripts, to train a new ecclesiastical and secular elite that could uphold the structure of his kingdom. To this end, he summoned scholars from various places: the Anglo-Saxon Alcuin of York, the Lombard Paul the Deacon, the Hispanic Theodulf of Orleans. Together, they designed schools, reformed the educational system, and promoted the creation of a more legible and standardized script, the Carolingian minuscule, which would facilitate the transmission of knowledge for centuries. That empire, being born among fertile fields and illuminated monasteries, among embroidered banners and theological treatises, still needed a symbolic act to seal its place in history. And that act came on a cold morning in the year 800, when Charlemagne, dressed in the garments of a pilgrim, entered St. Peter's Basilica in Rome to celebrate Christmas Mass. There, Pope Leo III surprised him, or at least that is how the chronicles tell it, by placing a crown on his head and proclaiming him Emperor of the Romans. This was not just a ceremony. It was a colossal affirmation. Rome was reborn. The imperial throne, empty since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, was once again occupied, not by a direct descendant of Caesar, but by a Frankish king anointed by the Church. That gesture, however, was not well received in Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire still stood, and its emperors believed that the imperial title belonged to them by right. The proclamation of Charlemagne was seen as a provocation, as an illegitimate duplication of power. Thus, although diplomatic contacts were established to recognize each other's spheres of influence, the division between East and West deepened. Christendom was no longer one. The schism, not yet formalized, pulsed beneath the political, theological, and cultural differences that intensified with the passing of the years. During his years as emperor, Charlemagne traveled tirelessly through his lands without establishing a fixed capital. His itinerant court moved with him, like a kind of mobile government that supervised, inspected, resolved conflicts, and reinforced central authority. In Aachen, however, he ordered the construction of an imperial palace with a chapel that evoked the forms of San Vitale in Ravenna. That place became the symbol of his rule, the spiritual and political center of his empire. When he died, in the year 814, Charlemagne left behind a vast and complex kingdom, an empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to Rome. His body was buried in Aachen, and over the centuries, his tomb would become a place of pilgrimage, the subject of legends, a point of reference for future emperors who would seek in his figure a model to imitate. It was said that he was not laid to rest lying down, but seated on a throne, with the crown still on his head and an open book in his hands. As if even in death, he continued to rule. After his departure, the Carolingian dream began to crack. His heirs lacked his leadership abilities and vision. The Treaty of Verdun, signed in the year 843, divided the empire among his grandsons, thus planting the seeds of the future nations of France and Germany. The empire fragmented, and the ideal of unity began to fade. However, the legacy of Charlemagne did not disappear. His figure was invoked by the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, by popes, by monarchs who sought to cloak themselves in legitimacy. But beyond political ambitions, what Charlemagne left behind was a structure. A network of monasteries, schools, libraries, bishoprics, and laws that continued to function for centuries. His dream, although it did not survive as a political unity, lived on as an idea, the idea of a Christian Europe, unified around knowledge, law, and the cross. And while in the Carolingian lands, monks continued copying manuscripts, while bells rang out from abbeys built with solid stones and ancient hope, across the fields and hills of the continent, a social system was consolidating that would shape the daily lives of millions of people for centuries. Feudalism, an invisible web of bonds, oaths, lands, swords, and personal loyalties that would replace the old empire with another form of organization, more fragmented, yet just as enduring. Feudalism, land, loyalty, and sword. After the tentative greatness of the Carolingian Empire, when the imposing figure of Charlemagne disappeared from the scene and his heirs fractured the map in internal disputes, what remained was a continent in need of reorganization from its very roots. Without a strong central authority, without professional armies answering to a single sovereign, Europe slowly transformed into a land of oaths and domains, of personal pacts and unbreakable bonds forged under the promise of protection and loyalty. Thus was feudalism born, not as a system planned on paper, but as a network woven over centuries at the pace of necessity, violence, and survival. The feudal world had no clear borders, no universal capitals, no uniform codes. It was a web in which land was the currency of power, and where every piece of arable soil carried not only crops, but also complex social relationships. The king was no longer an omnipresent figure, nor an administrator of empires. In many cases, he was merely the most powerful lord of all, the highest point in a pyramid of vassalage that descended from the court to the most remote corners of the lordships. At the heart of this structure beat a word that defined everything: the fief. It was not just a piece of land, it was an entire package of rights, duties, and promises. The lord granted the vassal a territory to govern, exploit, and defend. In return, the vassal owed loyalty, military assistance, counsel, and financial help in times of need. It was a bilateral relationship, ceremonial but profoundly practical. There was no bureaucracy to record everything, no state archives, no tax officials. What mattered was the word given before God, the joined hands of vassal and lord, the oath solemnly spoken in the hall of a castle or beneath the altar of a church. This bond between man and man multiplied in chains. A count could be the vassal of a duke and in turn have his own vassals, knights, barons, minor local lords. Power was fragmented, decentralized, sometimes confusing, but it was functional. Because what it offered was stability in a world threatened by raids, looting, and family feuds. In the absence of a strong state, the feudal lord became protector, judge, and administrator. He was the one who ensured the harvest, organized the defense of the castle, negotiated with his peers, or imposed his will by force when necessary. Land not only sustained the economy, it also defined the hierarchy. The more land one controlled, the more men one could feed, the more horses one could maintain, the more armor one could produce. Power was tangible, visible in hectares, in villages, in mills, in forests. Each territory had its own structure. The castle on high ground, villages scattered around it, fields worked by peasants who were not owners, but dependents. Many of them were tied to the land through bonds of servitude. They were not slaves, but they were not free either. They were born on the domain, worked for the Lord, gave him part of the harvest, built roads, maintained the defenses. In return, they received protection, shelter, and the chance to survive. The figure of the knight embodied the warrior ideal of this world. Men of arms, trained from childhood, swore loyalty to their lord and were prepared to fight whenever necessary. Their lives revolved around war, honor, and the defense of the fief. But there also existed a code of conduct aimed at tempering their brutality. Chivalry was meant to be guided by values such as piety, justice, and loyalty. Although in practice these ideals were betrayed as often as they were proclaimed, they became an essential part of courtly culture and the medieval imagination. Castles, first built of wood and later of stone, were fortresses, but also residences, centers of power projecting authority over the surrounding territory. They were difficult to take, surrounded by walls, moats, watchtowers. In times of war, they offered refuge to the local population. In times of peace, they hosted feasts, banquets, war councils, or arranged marriages to solidify alliances. Each castle was a world unto itself, self-sufficient, with its own blacksmith, chapel, grain storehouse, and dungeon. The church, already holding a prominent place in spiritual life, was also integrated into this feudal structure. Bishops and abbots administered lands, had vassals, took part in conflicts, and were key figures in local and regional politics. Many monasteries functioned as centers of agricultural production, aid to the poor, and refuge for pilgrims. The ecclesiastical network intertwined with the nobility through marriages, donations, and patronage, reinforcing the social order with the belief that each person had a divinely assigned place. The feudal world was divided into three fundamental orders: those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. It was a profoundly hierarchical vision of the world, but also one clear in its functions. The oratores, the clergy, cared for souls. The bellatores, the nobles and warriors, defended the order. And the laboratores, the peasants, produced what was necessary for the other two to exist. This structure was theologically justified. Each class had its role, its duty, its reward, either on earth or in the afterlife. And yet, none of this was unchangeable. Mobility existed, conflicts broke out, loyalties were broken. The Middle Ages were also the setting for local wars, rivalries among nobles, betrayals among vassals, castles taken by assault, kings trying to reclaim their authority from lords who behaved like sovereigns. But for centuries, this feudal system functioned as the skeleton of Europe. It supported life, organized production, defined social bonds, and allowed for a recognizable form of order even in times of uncertainty. The agrarian economy that sustained this system depended on natural rhythms, on seasons that marked time with relentless precision. The year was divided between sowing and harvesting, between fieldwork and religious festivals that gave meaning to the passing of time. On workdays, the fields were places of sweat and silence. On feast days, the church filled with color, music, and promises of salvation. Everything revolved around the land: sustenance, wealth, power, hope. And in that landscape that seemed frozen in time, new shoots slowly began to sprout. Agricultural production increased, tools improved, new fields were cleared. Some villages began to grow, to organize markets, to attract artisans, merchants, and outsiders. Feudalism, which had been born as a response to a world in ruins, began to coexist with a different phenomenon: the rebirth of cities. That movement, barely visible at first, would change the course of Europe. Because when the countryside was no longer enough, when roads filled with carts and bell towers gave way to market towers, the rural and the urban began to meet, and from that encounter would emerge a new energy, a new way of medieval life. Vikings, the terror from the north. As Europe was beginning to consolidate a fragile feudal order, as lords were building their castles and the church was strengthening its spiritual and material domains, from the cold mists of the north emerged ships that seemed to have come out of a nightmare. They had the shape of dragons, their sails were red like blood, and their crews appeared to fear neither death nor foreign gods. These long-haired men, with gleaming axes and ritual chants, sailed across seas, rivers, and coasts with the confidence of those who knew the world was meant to be explored, plundered, or conquered. Thus came the Vikings, and for more than 2 centuries, their shadow loomed over all of Europe. The term Viking does not describe a single unified people or a specific ethnicity. It encompasses the peoples who lived in what we now know as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, and who, between the 8th and the 11th centuries, carried out one of the most surprising expansions in medieval history. They were not an organized army under a single command, nor did they follow a common ideology. What they shared was an ancient maritime culture, a sense of honor forged in the storms of the Baltic Sea, and a burning desire for wealth, glory, and adventure. The first major impact came in the year 793, when a group of raiders landed on the island of Lindisfarne on the northeastern coast of England and devastated its monastery. It was not just an attack on a sacred building, it was a blow to the very heart of northern Christian culture. These men entered mercilessly, burned codices, beheaded monks, stole golden chalices, and vanished as quickly as they had arrived. The news spread like fire among the Anglo-Saxon peoples, who saw in the Vikings not mere thieves, but messengers of divine wrath. The terror did not come from visible armies, but from the fog. In the following decades, the raids multiplied. Navigating along rivers, the Vikings managed to penetrate deep into the heart of kingdoms that had seemed secure. London, Paris, Seville, Hamburg. No city was untouchable. The longships they built, light and flexible, could sail both on open seas and inland rivers, giving them tactical mobility that was unattainable for most European armies of the time. They struck and withdrew before anyone could respond, and if they encountered resistance, they returned months later with more men and better strategy. But the Vikings were not just raiders. Many of them settled, founded colonies, created trade routes and settlements that, over time, grew into stable cities. In the region of the Danelaw, in eastern England, they established their own laws and systems of governance influenced by their Norse traditions. In Ireland, they founded Dublin as an operational base and turned it into an important trading center. In western France, the leader Rollo was granted lands by King Charles the Simple in exchange for swearing loyalty and protecting the region from future raids. That land would come to be known as Normandy, the land of the men from the north. The versatility of the Vikings was astounding. A single warrior could be a raider one year, a merchant the next, and a feudal lord the following year. Their culture valued cunning, strength, and keeping one's word. In their sagas, passed down orally for generations, epic feats, impossible voyages, and carefully executed acts of revenge were glorified. Women held a more active role than was common in other European societies. Some even managed households in the absence of men or took part in expeditions. Rich graves have been discovered that reveal the existence of female warriors, buried with weapons, jewelry, and respect. In the east, the Swedish Vikings, known as Varangians, advanced along the great Russian rivers and established trade routes connecting the Baltic Sea with the Black Sea and Constantinople. Some even served as elite guards to the Byzantine emperor. The Varangian Guard, with their massive axes and reputation for loyalty, became a symbol of prestige. On their journeys, they established contact with Slavic peoples, founded Kiev and Novgorod, and gave rise to what would later become Kievan Rus, a civilization that blended Norse, Slavic, and Byzantine elements. Even more extraordinary was their expansion into the Atlantic Ocean. The Norwegian Vikings sailed to Iceland, where they established a parliamentary society that was remarkably advanced for its time. They later reached Greenland and even crossed to the American continent, centuries before Christopher Columbus. On the shores of what we now call Newfoundland, they left traces of a settlement they called Vinland. Although these colonies did not last, the mere fact that they attempted it shows the breadth of their ambition and their mastery of the sea. However, the era of major Viking raids had an expiration date. As European kingdoms strengthened their defenses, organized more solid armies, and built fortifications at key points, the attacks became less effective. At the same time, many Viking leaders began to convert to Christianity. Some did so out of conviction, others out of convenience, understanding that adopting the dominant faith made it easier to integrate into the continent's power structures. With conversion came marriage alliances, recognized crowns, and adapted genealogies. What had initially been perceived as a hurricane of violence ended up being absorbed by the very Europe they had once shaken. The Vikings became Normans, kings, dukes, merchants, and crusaders. Their legacy, however, remained alive. The Icelandic sagas, the design of their ships, their navigation techniques, and their cultural influence left visible marks. In many regions, the noble lineage of families descended from those northern warriors who, centuries earlier, had sown fear in the name of honor and freedom. The terror they inspired was real, but so too was their ability to transform, to adapt, to cease being a threat, and become an essential part of the medieval fabric. While the European peasant prayed for the protection of his lord, while monasteries reinforced their walls and kings signed defensive treaties, the men of the north were shaping, through oar, sword, and pact, the profile of a continent that would never be the same again. The Viking legacy did not vanish with their conversion or with the passage of time. It endures in legends, in languages, in surnames, in runestones, and in the collective memory of a Europe that, though it tried to forget them as a past threat, could not help but admire them as part of its own origin. The rebirth of cities. For centuries, Europe was a land of fields. Life revolved around cultivation, the weather, unpredictable harvests, the regular toll of the monastery bell, and the unshakable silhouette of the castle dominating the horizon. In that rural landscape, the ancient city, the one that during the Roman Empire had been a center of power, trade, and culture, seemed to have withered away, turned into a ruin or a reduced walled refuge. However, toward the end of the first millennium, new sounds began to be heard. The echo of hammers striking anvils, the bustle of markets, the rumble of carts loaded with cloth, wine, and grain, the murmur of mingled languages around a well. Something was awakening. Cities were beginning to be reborn. This urban resurgence was neither immediate nor uniform, but its force would be so profound that it would reshape the entire face of Europe. Starting in the 11th century, new cities began to emerge and ancient Roman settlements were revitalized. Some were born at crossroads, others beside bridges, abbeys, or fortresses. Many arose under the protection of a feudal lord, but soon sought their own space of freedom. These were places where land was no longer the most important asset, where value resided in skill, ingenuity, and the ability to negotiate, craft, and trade. The transformation was quiet but constant. As agricultural techniques improved, with new plows, the three-field rotation system, and a modest increase in crop yields, the population grew. More mouths meant more hands, and more hands generated surpluses. What had once barely sufficed for survival could now be exchanged. And that exchange needed a place, a meeting point. Thus came the fairs, the seasonal markets, the squares filled with improvised stalls, and around them, the city. The medieval city was not the majestic metropolis we might imagine today. At first, it was a cluster of tightly packed houses with dirt streets, no sewage system, and wooden buildings where fire and epidemics were constant threats. But despite the discomforts, they had something magnetic. They were places of opportunity. In them, a peasant could become an apprentice. A son of serfs could aspire to live without being bound to a manor. Simply residing in a city for a certain period of time, as was often stated in many regions, was enough to gain freedom. City air makes you free, the jurists said. The emerging bourgeoisie, formed by merchants, artisans, and bankers, had no noble blood, but they were beginning to acquire something even more valuable: money, connections, and growing political influence. These burghers did not want land. They wanted charters. They wanted documents that guaranteed them autonomy, tax exemptions, the right to elect their own magistrates, to set prices and tolls. In many cases, the cities bought their freedom from the feudal lord who protected them. In others, they took it by force. In every case, power was shifting. The urban social fabric was different from that of the countryside. Here, vassalage did not rule. Guild membership did. Trades were organized into guilds: blacksmiths, shoemakers, weavers, butchers, bakers. Each guild had its rules, its patron saint, its internal hierarchy, its distinctive seal. They controlled product quality, set prices, and trained apprentices in a process that could take years. Becoming a guildmaster meant achieving prestige. It meant opening a workshop, hiring assistants, and participating in local politics. Urban architecture began to reflect this new dynamism. Walls were expanded, churches rose skyward, first in Romanesque and later in Gothic style. And town halls began to be built as symbols of civil power. In some cities, universities developed. In others, mints. And in the wealthiest, hospitals, public clocks, and archives. Urban time was organized differently. It was no longer just the time of the land and harvest, but also the time of the workshop bell, tax collection, and the arrival of the market. The most important fairs became nerve centers of the continent. In Champagne, in Flanders, in the cities of northern Italy, merchants gathered from distant places to exchange fabrics, spices, salt, metals, wine, wool, amber. Money began to circulate more regularly, and with it emerged the first stable financial institutions: lending houses, bills of exchange, long-term trade associations. The monetary economy was resurging, and with it, new forms of power. This urban rebirth was especially intense in Italy. Cities like Florence, Venice, Milan, and Genoa became independent republics, governed by councils of wealthy citizens, by families who combined commerce with politics and banking with culture. A different atmosphere was felt in them, a certain sense of belonging to something new. Their classical texts were recovered with fervor, art was promoted, and investment in public works flourished. Although this already belongs to the threshold of the Renaissance, the roots of that transformation were clearly anchored in this urban awakening of the 11th and 12th centuries. In the north, the cities of the Baltic Sea and the North Sea began to join into a trade network known as the Hanseatic League. From Lübeck to Bruges, passing through Hamburg, Riga, and other northern ports, a formidable maritime trade was organized, protected by their own fleets and regulated by treaties between cities. It was a different Europe, more connected, more fluid, more alive. However, this rebirth was not free of tensions. Cities competed with each other for routes, markets, and privileges. The differences between rich and poor grew sharper, and in many cases, the lesser guilds or humbler sectors rebelled against the mercantile elites. Urban revolts, though less well known than great feudal battles, revealed that social conflict was not exclusive to the countryside. Relations with the nobility were also ambiguous. Some lords saw in the cities a source of income, others a threat. The kings, for their part, began to rely on them to counteract the power of the nobles. By granting charters to cities, creating urban taxes, and summoning burghers to their councils, monarchs found new allies in their process of consolidating power. The city, then, was not only an economic phenomenon, but also a political one. It redefined the balance of medieval power. Through the cities, Europe began to recover something that had lain dormant for centuries: horizontal dynamism, rapid exchange, social pluralism. Languages, accents, clothing, recipes, superstitions, songs, all were mixing. Stories from distant lands were told, news was read on the walls, liberal arts schools were founded, books were sold. The ringing of bells now marked a time that was no longer just ecclesiastical or agricultural, but urban, mobile, and restless. And while merchants turned corners with their loaded mules, while apprentices swept the workshop floors at dawn, while mayors opened the ledgers and students debated in Latin beneath the arcades, the medieval world was preparing for a new kind of war. A war that would lead the continent beyond itself, driven by faith, by the sword, and by the promise of redemption. Because on the horizon of this resurgent Europe, a word was rising that would change its history forever: crusade. The Crusades, faith and fire. A century had passed since the first cities began to rise again among the plains and dusty roads of Europe. A new vitality had slowly fermented across the continent. The lands had become more fertile, the fields more productive, the villages more crowded, and the cities more restless. Cathedrals began to rise toward the sky like stone spires. Monasteries overflowed with manuscripts. Merchants traveled routes that crossed rivers and mountain ranges. And amid all this movement, something less visible but just as powerful was also growing. An idea. An idea that spoke of salvation, of struggle, and of sacred land. An idea that would soon become flames. The flames of the Crusades. It was in the year 1095 in the city of Clermont, when Pope Urban II addressed a crowd gathered in a mixture of fervor, fear, and expectation. His speech, inflamed by rhetoric, political tension, and the promise of redemption, shook the hearts of those who heard it. He called on the Christians of Europe to take up arms, to abandon their homes, their lands, their debts, and their sins, and march toward Jerusalem, the city where Christ had lived, had died, and according to the faith, had risen from the dead. The Holy Land had been under Muslim control for centuries, but after the recent expansion of the Seljuk Turks, pilgrimage routes had begun to close, and reports of attacks and desecrations, whether true or not, spread like fire through dry wheat. The words of the Pope ignited the European spirit. Nobles, peasants, merchants, clerics, even thieves and beggars began to mobilize. Some saw the crusade as a sacred mission, others an opportunity to gain land, loot, or prestige. But all, in one way or another, responded to a unique call: to unite Christendom in a common goal beyond its many internal divisions, to cross the sea, to travel thousands of kilometers through unknown lands, to fight invisible enemies, and to reach, at last, the sacred city. It was an unprecedented epic. The First Crusade, despite its difficulties, was a military success. After years of hardship, battles, and sieges, the Crusaders managed to take Jerusalem in the year 1099. The final assault was bloody. Christian sources describe it with exultation, Muslim sources with horror. The streets ran red. The crusade, which had begun as a march of penance, ended as an orgy of violence. But for many in Europe, it was a sign of divine victory. The so-called Crusader states were established: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch. They were fragile enclaves, sustained by hastily built castles, temporary pacts with local lords, and a faith that had to be constantly renewed in the face of heat, disease, and fear. The subsequent crusades lacked the clarity of the first. The second, called after the fall of Edessa, was a disaster. The third, led by figures as famous as Richard the Lionheart, Philip Augustus of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, faced Saladin, the great Muslim leader who managed to recapture Jerusalem in 1187 after his victory at Hattin. Saladin was a feared enemy, but also admired by many Europeans. His reputation for chivalry and wisdom spread even among his adversaries, shaping the myth of the noble enemy. For 2 centuries, the Crusades followed one after another, changing objectives, methods, and settings. There were crusades in the Holy Land, in Egypt, in North Africa, in the Iberian Peninsula, in the Baltic, and even in Constantinople. Because over time, the ideal of crusade became a malleable tool, used by both the church and kings for purposes that often had little to do with the spiritual. The Fourth Crusade is perhaps the clearest example of that deviation. Originally called to conquer Egypt, it ended with the brutal sack of Constantinople, the capital of Eastern Christianity, in 1204. The Crusaders looted churches, desecrated relics, destroyed works of art, and humiliated the population. It was a deep wound between East and West, an irreparable betrayal among Christians. The Crusades also altered the ideological landscape of Europe. The idea of holy war was reinforced. The military orders were consolidated, such as the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights, blending monastic life with military discipline, and the discourse that faith must be defended with the sword was strengthened. The contact with the Islamic world was intense and contradictory. In the cities of the Levant, Europeans discovered markets full of perfumes, exotic fruits, finely forged weapons, and unknown scientific and medical texts. Cultural exchanges occurred, although often masked by the shadow of war. Through the Crusades, Europe discovered the other, the enemy, but also its own reflection. For many men and women, joining a crusade meant renouncing everything they knew. Entire families said farewell, knowing they might never see each other again. Some died before even arriving. Others returned years later, marked by physical and spiritual scars. There were individual epics that became legend: wandering knights who crossed the desert, pilgrims who survived by miracles, sultans who showed mercy, and friars who preached among Muslims. The map of the world expanded in the European imagination. Jerusalem was no longer just a biblical name. It was a political objective, a religious obsession, a symbol of glory and defeat. The Crusades also left a legal footprint. Many nobles who departed for the Holy Land sold their lands, their rights and titles, provoking a redistribution movement that altered the feudal balance. Cities took advantage of the opportunity to buy privileges, to negotiate charters, to gain autonomy. The crusade, even when fought far away, reshaped the very fabric of the continent. Moreover, the popes who promoted them gained unprecedented power, the ability to mobilize multitudes, to impose global campaigns, to forgive sins through armed participation. The idea of penance became intertwined with violence. Eternal salvation could be obtained by wielding a sword. But as time passed, the initial passion faded. Popular enthusiasm declined. The last crusades no longer drew large crowds, nor carried the mystique of the beginning. In their place were abandoned fortresses, scattered ruins, fragmented memories. The Kingdom of Jerusalem gradually fell until, in 1291, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land, St. John of Acre, was taken by the Mamluks. It was the end of an era. However, the Crusades did not disappear. Their legacy persisted in the collective imagination, in liturgy, in oral storytelling, in heroic tales written by chroniclers who turned the campaigns into epics. The images of the Crusader knight, the redemptive journey, the battle between light and darkness, remained engraved in the soul of Europe. Even centuries later, they would be used to justify wars, to promote unity, to support imperial ambitions. And when the last banners with the Red Cross vanished in the wind, and the routes to the Holy Land were closed or rendered irrelevant, the world that returned to Europe was no longer the same. Contact with the East had left new routes open, new objects of desire, new unanswered questions. And among those newly drawn paths, knowledge began to circulate at a speed Europe had not known for centuries. Because from the ashes of holy war, ancient words began to blossom again, words that were coming back to life: logic, medicine, algebra, astronomy. The return of knowledge had begun. And that knowledge, almost forgotten, almost extinguished, was about to awaken in cloisters, in cathedrals, in the first universities. What would come next would be no less revolutionary. It would be, in a way, a rebirth. But first, it was necessary to pass through the classrooms, the manuscripts, the debates of the wise. And that is where we will go next, to that place where faith met reason, and the world began to think again. The universities and the resurrected knowledge. Sometimes the most profound changes make no noise. They are not announced with swords, coronations, or bells of war. Sometimes the world is transformed in the silent gesture of a quill over parchment, in the spark of an idea that leaps across generations, or in the murmur of a conversation that stretches beyond nightfall, beneath the wooden ceilings of an improvised school. Thus began the rebirth of knowledge in Europe. After centuries of uncertainty, wars, faith, and fire, thought began to open its eyes once again. And it did so in an unexpected place, within the classrooms of the first universities. These institutions were born without official foundations or imperial decrees. They were not founded by kings, nor built according to monumental blueprints. Rather, they emerged spontaneously as the result of a growing need. In a continent that had begun once more to speak in terms of commerce, administration, law, medicine, and theological debate, the demand for specialized education multiplied. Knowledge was no longer the privilege of a few cloistered monks. It had become a useful tool, desired, even contested. Before the universities, knowledge lived in monasteries. In those secluded spaces, monks had kept alive the flame of ancient texts. Within cold, damp walls, they copied, letter by letter, works from antiquity, treatises on philosophy, fragments of history, compilations of canon law. It was static knowledge, preserved with devotion, but not meant to expand or be questioned. The medieval reader did not interpret. He recited. He did not comment. He revered. But that attitude was about to change. Beginning in the 12th century, Europe rediscovered Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, and many other classical authors through Arabic translations. These works, preserved and commented on in centers like Baghdad, Cordoba, or Toledo, returned to Europe through the hands of Muslim and Jewish intellectuals. Philosophers such as Averroes and Maimonides not only transmitted the words of the ancients, but also offered their own interpretations, their doubts, their syntheses. It was a true reimportation of reason. The University of Bologna, specializing in law, was one of the first to become established. There, jurists analyzed Roman legal texts, broke them down, updated them, compared them with current legislation. Legal knowledge became a profession, a science. In Paris, the focus was on theology. The Sorbonne attracted brilliant teachers and restless students who debated the nature of God, the Trinity, the relationship between faith and reason. Oxford and Cambridge were founded following this model, adapting it to the needs of an England already in full intellectual ferment. The universities were not buildings but communities. What defined a university was its universitas, the gathering of teachers and students who established their own rules, their own calendars, their own exams and privileges. They were often under the protection of the Pope or the King, but they maintained a remarkable autonomy. Latin was the shared language of these institutions. In the courtyards, in the dining halls, and in the nearby streets, young people greeted one another, debated, and quarreled in the language of Cicero, Augustine, and Boethius. It was a multilingual Europe that thought in a common tongue. The curriculum was organized around the liberal arts, divided into two parts: the trivium, composed of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium, which included arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These disciplines were the necessary threshold before accessing higher studies: medicine, law, or theology. A student could spend years debating a single phrase by Aristotle or unraveling the logical implications of a statement by Augustine. Time in the universities was measured in readings, glosses, and public debates. The methods were rigorous. The teacher read the text aloud, commented on it, and explained it. The student had to learn it, repeat it, and question it. There were formal disputes in which opposing viewpoints clashed. The goal was not simply to memorize, but to understand, to argue, to persuade. From this environment emerged the great medieval logicians, the scholastic theologians, the philosophers who dared to ask the unthinkable. Can reason prove the existence of God? Does the soul have a natural origin? What is the meaning of eternity? One of the major figures of this period was Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican, tireless writer, systematic thinker, and builder of bridges between the philosophy of Aristotle and Christian doctrine. His monumental work, the Summa Theologica, sought to organize all existing knowledge, to classify fundamental questions, and to provide clear, rational, and harmonious answers. It was not about destroying faith with reason, but about showing that both could walk together. His influence was such that, for centuries, his thought was considered the perfect model of balance between belief and logic. But not everyone agreed. There were tensions, intellectual heresies, confrontations among teachers. Some defended the supremacy of reason. Others distrusted rationalist temptation. The university was also a battlefield of ideas, a laboratory where answers to eternal questions were tested. The medieval spirit, deeply religious, began to wonder whether God could be conceived by the human mind, and to what extent the world could be understood through the tools of the intellect. In medicine, the treatises of Galen and Hippocrates were revisited, but practical observations, dissections, and empirical analyses were also introduced, rudimentary for now, yet foreshadowing the scientific method. In astronomy, the geocentric model of Ptolemy, which placed the Earth at the center of the universe, was widely accepted. And yet, marginal voices were already daring to imagine other celestial orders. Over time, the universities became centers of power. They controlled degrees, professions, and libraries. They trained the clerics who would become advisors to kings, the physicians of the courts, the judges, and the notaries. They were not revolutionary institutions in the political sense, but they were revolutionary in their capacity to form elites that thought in a structured way, using increasingly sophisticated conceptual tools. Knowledge was no longer static. It became mobile, transmittable, and subject to debate. Books were copied more quickly. Libraries began to be organized. Systems were invented to classify knowledge. And although the printing press did not yet exist, the drive to record, comment, preserve, and share knowledge was growing stronger. The manuscript was no longer a sacred, unique object, but a tool for work. Medieval knowledge, far from being blind repetition, was a process of accumulation, of tension, and of the desire for order. Through the universities, Europe recovered an essential part of its ancient heritage, combined it with contributions from the Islamic and Jewish worlds, and generated an intellectual body that would shape the centuries to come. In those classrooms were born the questions that, centuries later, would ignite the minds of the Renaissance and modern science. And when students left class at dusk, walking under oil lanterns, wrapped in cloaks, with books under their arms and their heads full of ideas, they were not merely young scholars seeking a diploma. They were the bearers of a new flame, the flame of thought, which was beginning to burn once more in Europe. And as that flame spread through cloisters and study halls, in castles, in tournaments, in epic poems, another central figure of the medieval imagination was taking shape: the knight. Not the simple warrior, but the ideal forged between the sword, honor, and poetry. And that will be our next scene. Castles and knights, the art of war. Medieval Europe was not a place of constant peace, nor of prolonged stability. Even though churches were filled with incense and monasteries preserved knowledge with devotion, the European countryside was marked by tension, blood rivalries, territorial disputes, and the constant need to defend what had been conquered. In this landscape, made of hills, dense forests, and insecure roads, two undeniable symbols of power and resistance emerged: the castle and the knight. The castle was not just a fortress, nor simply a noble residence. It was a visible declaration of dominion, a warning, a refuge, and at the same time, a war machine. Built first in wood and later in stone, it was erected on hills, cliffs, or strategic passes, following a logic that served both defense and prestige. Its towers allowed for the surveillance of vast expanses. Its thick walls withstood catapult assaults, and its moats complicated the advance of any army. A well-placed castle could control entire valleys, trade routes, entrances to cities, or regions rich in resources. From there, justice was administered, taxes were collected, alliances were negotiated, and wars were declared. Each castle had its own structure, its unmistakable footprint, adapted to the terrain and the character of its lord. Some had round towers, others square. The most advanced included barbicans, drawbridges, keeps, and concentric enclosures that multiplied the difficulty of any assault. But beyond its architectural elements, the castle had a soul. It was the heart of a feudal domain, the place where loyalty was sworn, where marriages were celebrated for political interests, and where war parties were organized to defend the honor of the house. Within those walls lived a figure that embodied the warrior ethic of the time, the knight. Turned into a myth by epic poems and courtly romances, the knight was originally a professional combatant, a mounted warrior who swore loyalty to his lord in exchange for a feudal benefit, generally in the form of land. But over the centuries, that figure became surrounded by a set of values, rituals, and expectations that transformed him into an ideal deeply rooted in the medieval imagination. The knight was trained from childhood. Born into the nobility, he began as a page, learning etiquette, the art of service, and obedience. Then, as a squire, he trained in the use of weapons, in hand-to-hand combat, in handling the war horse, and accompanied his lord on military campaigns. Only after proving valor, discipline, and ability was he knighted in a ceremony that combined the religious and the military. There, kneeling before his lord or an altar, he received the sword, the accolade, and the commitment to live according to the principles of chivalry. That chivalric code, though idealized by literature, had deep ethical implications. It spoke of loyalty, courage, protection of the weak, obedience to the Christian faith, and personal honor. The word of a knight was to be law. His shield was to represent his lineage and his merits. His horse, his armor, and his weapons were extensions of his status and identity. But the reality of war, as always, often relativized those principles. Many knights were looters, executioners, opportunists. Others, however, tried to live by that ideal, aware that their place in the world depended on more than brute strength. Medieval warfare was a difficult, unpredictable art. It was not fought in open fields as shown in films, but through prolonged sieges, quick skirmishes, and nighttime raids. The siege was the most common form of combat. These could last for weeks or even months, where hunger, disease, and time were weapons as powerful as catapults. Castles were designed to withstand, and the knight, more than a field warrior, was an expert in holding positions, coordinating defenses, and negotiating strategic truces. Plate armor, the kind that fully covered the knight's body, appeared around the 14th century. Before that, chainmail, large shields, and open helmets were used. The development of military equipment was a race between defense and attack. Spears, longswords, composite bows, and later, the first gunpowder weapons changed the balance of combat. But for centuries, the mounted knight, armed to the teeth and trained to endure brutal blows, was the core of the feudal army. Tournaments, often mistaken for games, were carefully ritualized military exercises. They allowed for training, displays of bravery, and competition for prestige. The tournament was not a trivial spectacle. For the nobility, it was an opportunity to demonstrate combat ability without the need for a real war. Jousting, lance combats, and simulated battles in enclosed fields all followed a system of honor that defined the hierarchy of participants. Alongside the sword, courtly poetry built another face of the knight: the faithful lover, the servant of the lady, the defender of ideal love. From the castles of southern France, troubadours began to sing of feats where love was as important as war. That image, often far removed from real life, permeated the soul of European nobility for generations. The unattainable lady, loyalty without reward, spiritualized beauty. All of this formed part of the chivalric imagination. In many ways, the figure of the knight was shaped as much by the reality of combat as by the desire to belong to a cultural elite. It was a model of behavior that was transmitted, learned, and represented. But over time, that figure also began to show cracks. New forms of warfare, armies of mercenaries, cities that demanded other types of leadership, kings who wanted loyal troops paid with money and not with land, began to question the usefulness of feudal knighthood. Even so, castles and knights did not disappear overnight. For centuries, they continued to be the basis of territorial defense, the expression of military power, and the embodiment of a system that, although beginning to change, remained fundamental to the social structure. And beyond their practical role, they left an aesthetic, symbolic mark deeply rooted in Europe's cultural memory. Medieval fortresses still rise atop hills as silent witnesses of time. And in their empty halls, among walls worn down by wind and moss, one can still seem to hear the echo of hooves striking stone, of swords brushing against shields, of voices swearing loyalty before a cross. And while the art of war continued to evolve among towers, moats, and spears, another world, more hidden, more intimate, but just as complex, began to take shape within the margins of official history. The universe of medieval women, their lives, their silences, and their resistance. That will be our next journey. The world of medieval women. In an era where the sword-raised kingdoms and castles dominated the plains, the female presence was often hidden among the stones and parchments. But if we stop and listen closely, we discover that medieval women occupied unexpected spaces, exercised real power, wove networks of influence, and silently guarded passions, knowledge, and resistance that official history has often forgotten. Their world was not homogeneous, nor deliberately refined, but it held a subtle, deep, and at times rebellious strength. In the villages, women worked side by side with their husbands, tending the garden, watching over the children, milking cows, caring for the domestic pig, and at times serving as healers using herbs gathered from the edges of the forest. They were an essential part of the agricultural cycle, and without their contribution, many communities would have perished. During festivals and celebrations, they participated in songs and parish duties, accompanied the seasons of the year, and sustained daily religious life with their voice and intuition. All of this without exercising formal power, but upholding the social fabric from its foundation. In the cities, some women managed to become merchants, property administrators, leaseholders of entire neighborhoods, or directors of family businesses when their husbands were away at war. The doors of the guilds were closed to them, but the street and the marketplace were umbrellas under which they could undertake ventures. Widows, in particular, had economic autonomy that bordered on freedom. With their seal, their employees, and their capital, they managed workshops, sold fabrics, and offered loans. They calculated margins and kept accounts, often better than their male counterparts, although with less recognition. At court, the noblewoman was a living strategy. Through marriage, alliances between kingdoms were solidified, borders defined, and succession secured. But beneath that appearance of a diplomatic peace, many women wielded effective power. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France and later of England, transformed her court into a center of poetry, patronage, and political influence. She shares her seat with figures such as Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess and polymath who wrote theological treatises, medical texts, mystical visions, and music. Both exercised an influence that transcended their gender, reshaping ideas of authority in their environments. The woman cloistered in a convent also had a voice. The monastery was not only a place of prayer, it was a sanctuary, an educational institution, an intellectual refuge. Many abbesses, such as Mechthild of Magdeburg or Roswitha of Gandersheim, pursued literary studies, managed property, and wrote chronicles or poetry. Within the walls they could own land, hire laborers, administer justice. And in some cases, they initiated reform movements or advised the Pope or kings. Their influence was tangible, discreet, and sometimes as powerful as that of a feudal lord. Motherhood imposed a kind of daily, invisible power, giving birth, educating children, ensuring their survival was a mission laden with popular wisdom. Women transmitted beliefs, rituals, songs, home remedies. They cared for the sick, sewed clothing, preserved family memory. They were the backbone of the household and the local community. They held no grand titles, but they possessed moral and social authority. Women who crossed borders, as pilgrims, itinerant traders, wives of warriors on campaign, or diplomatic contacts, possessed a special kind of power, the power of movement. Of medieval Argentina there is little. But between Europe and the Holy Land, women accompanied caravans, traced routes as messengers, found their voice in the exchange of languages and objects. Along their journeys, they created invisible cultural bridges. Medieval heroic narratives do not recall many combative women, except for Joan of Arc, who would appear centuries later. But there are subtler examples of resistance. Women who opposed feudal abuses, who refused arranged marriages, who maintained legal strategies to protect their inheritance, their dowry, their property. They rejected male succession, avoided marriage by coercion, or simply declared a call to the convent in order not to be caught in political pacts. Each gesture was a silent cry for autonomy. Medieval popular culture, often overlooked behind courtly salons, sang stories of strong or enigmatic women, the Lady of the Lake, persecuted witches, wise mothers, and prophetic women. That imaginary world survived in folklore, in illustrated codices, in oral traditions that walked alongside official writing. And of course, not everything was freedom or power. Many women endured abusive marriages, lack of inheritance, lack of voice in the clergy, religious censorship, and dependence on men. But within those limits, they carved out spaces to build their identity. They resisted, quietly or actively. They accepted or rebelled. That in itself is their history, as diverse as it is human. The late Middle Ages would see some women gain access to more formal education, in urban schools or early university dialogues. But even before that, they measured daily life. They were guardians of a deep memory, wove community, defined codes of conduct, and in many cases left behind invisible traces that modern historians are only just beginning to follow. In the life of the medieval woman, the domestic and the public, the religious and the political, the symbolic and the practical all converged. Every house, every convent, every city street carries imprints of that kind, resilient presence, like the breeze passing through an old window, silent and unceasing. The way of St. James and the walking faith. From the hills of the Pyrenees to the green pastures of Galicia, the way of St. James was born as a sacred artery that crossed Europe, connecting kingdoms, pilgrims, legends, and hopes. What began as a murmur among monks about the tomb of the apostle became a human current sustained for centuries, a living tradition where the walking body was also the soul in transit. The history of the way dates back to the 9th century, when a tomb was discovered in Compostela and attributed to the apostle James the Greater, one of the disciples of Jesus. It was a discovery that ignited a deep spark in European Christianity. The relics offered a direct connection to the apostolic era, to the origin of the faith, to the miraculous. Suddenly, an unknown destination at the far western end of Europe took on profound meaning, calling hearts to travel hundreds, sometimes thousands, of kilometers to renew their belief and seek comfort, atonement, or redemption. During the Middle Ages, the way took shape along routes that began in numerous places, from France, from Italy, from Germany, from England. At each stage, hostels, hospitals, bridges, and chapels emerged along the way. Monasteries became beacons of hospitality. To fasten the leather belt and grip the pilgrim's staff was, for many, an act of faith more powerful than a repeated prayer beneath a golden dome. Walking those paths was to embrace disillusionment, fragility, and the hope that each step would speak to the soul. The medieval pilgrim embarked on an unpredictable journey. He set out with a credential that certified his status at hospitals, walked alongside other pilgrims, sometimes in large groups, other times alone. He slept on straw in communal shelters, survived on bread, fasting meals, and wine. And each night, beneath the open sky, he listened to stories, legends, and miracles. In Compostela, people spoke of ghostly apparitions that healed the sick, of discoveries of miraculous relics, of poetic resolutions to vows made along the way. The way was a realm of collective storytelling, a space where personal experience mingled with oral tradition. The route crossed different political territories, yet it was a road without borders. Spaniards, French, Italians, Germans, Flemish, Hungarians, men and women alike, all shared a common goal. In the shelters, languages, songs, and gestures of fraternity blended. It was a spontaneous cultural crossroads. Many of the cities we know today grew thanks to medieval pilgrimage. Burgos, León, Pamplona, Logroño, Santiago. These became thriving urban centers due to the continuous flow of walkers. The way wove a unique infrastructure of faith, art, and architecture. Churches were built at crossroads, with sculptures narrating the symbolic journey from sin to grace. Romanesque silversmiths left their marks on capitals, tympanums, and cloisters with scenes of the apostle, storms, protective wolves, and celestial guardians. And the saint, portrayed at the entrances of buildings, raised his staff and cried out, "Apostle James, help me!" to those in need of a divine word. The pilgrimage changed, as all things do. The population was no longer illiterate. Basic guides began to circulate, foldable maps, and stamps that documented completed stages. Hospitals were mandated by church councils. Funding was granted by kings. Indulgences were offered by Rome. And over time, the journey gained prestige. The king, the prince, the nobleman also walked, to redeem themselves, to justify their moral authority, to seek comfort at the apostles' tomb. The phenomenon also had its dark side. Poverty, illness, or violence could turn the peaceful map into a stage for assault, abuse, or deception. Pilgrimage was eternal and uncertain, but that was also its essence. To embrace fear and uncertainty, carrying the weight of an expectation that might become a revelation or a disappointment. The way promoted a profound spiritual experience, the continuous ascents and descents, the rhythm of the feet, the prayers at dawn, the nights marked by vigil and song, all aligned with a mysticism of the terrain. It was a bodily discipline with an existential dimension. Walking became a living metaphor, to move forward despite exhaustion, to seek the goal in the face of doubt, to look back without regret. And upon arriving at the cathedral, seeing the shell carved into the stone of the atrium, hearing the echo of the bell towers, many felt contact with the divine, a fulfilled promise, a stronger bond with their faith. And the tomb, covered with the silver chasuble, was a place where tears flowed sincerely. It was a symbol. If they had made it that far, they had completed a journey that went beyond their feet. They had crossed political, internal, and social borders. They had placed their lives in transit. The way had transformed them. And with those transformed pilgrims returned the words of St. James, words of miracles, of reconciliation, of purpose. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, the way slowly declined. It shifted in meaning, replaced by new local devotions, by the religious reform, by European wars. Many hostels closed. Some chapels fell into neglect. But the way was no longer a stone path. It had become a trace in Europe's collective memory. It was revived centuries later as a cultural symbol, as a personal spiritual journey, and as a continental connection. As both inner and outer journey, as agony and comfort, as rite and resilience, the way of St. James was, and still is, a deep metaphor for walking faith. A prayer made into steps, a promise sustained by the feet. And on that path, at times dark, at times radiant, was inscribed the medieval experience of seeking, of finding, and of being transformed in motion. And while the white stone of the Compostela temple received thousands of pilgrims, something else was stirring within Europe with that same ancient energy. Books were being opened, cloisters buzzed with life. Knights debated with friars, cities renewed their spirit. That dance of mysticism, power, and thought would soon give way to a crisis that would shake the continent. The Black Death was just around the corner. The Black Death, death over Europe. In the 14th century, Europe was undergoing a transformation. Cities pulsed with merchants, artisans, and students. The countryside prospered. The church remained stone and mystery. And life continued with a rhythm that seemed solid and medieval. Yet, in a sudden instant, that world came to a halt. Land and sea routes carried with them an unknown plague, an invisible threat that spread like a cold breath, devastating populations, cities, and souls. That calamity was called the Black Death, and what followed changed Europe forever. The plague likely arrived from Central Asia and traveled along trade routes to Constantinople and Marseille. From there, it infiltrated every corner of the continent through the network of roads, ports, and caravans. Terror began on the victims' faces. Swollen buboes in the groin and armpits, high fever, dark spots on the skin, and unbearable pain. The disease spread like wildfire, often wiping out an entire village within days. Ships were stranded in ports, corpses piled up, and survivors fled from any human contact. The mortality was brutal. It is estimated that 1/3 of Europe's population died in less than 5 years. Some regions lost half of their inhabitants. Cities were left deserted. Churches closed due to the lack of priests, and fields lay fallow with no one to work them. The impact was more than demographic. It was cultural, social, and psychological. Europe was facing a mass death of unprecedented magnitude. What was most disturbing was the speed. The plague would settle in a region and sweep through it without mercy. Physicians called it the Black Death, expecting divine judgment and having no concrete answers beyond purges, bloodletting, and prayers. Chaos accompanied the disease. Many religious groups tried to blame the Jewish population, accusing them of poisoning wells. As a result, pogroms and violence broke out, sometimes even preceding the arrival of the plague, as if intolerance were a spark before the biological storm. The Jewish people also suffered from the disease, but the narrative prevailed in many areas. The expulsion or murder of entire communities became a horrific expression of collective fear. The church was shaken to its core. Priests, monks, and laypeople died by the hundreds of thousands. The plague reached even the inner walls of monasteries. Part of the clergy fled or perished in the attempt, leaving spiritual communication interrupted. Meanwhile, the people were left abandoned, alone with their guilt and fear. Some interpreted the plague as divine punishment. Others turned to penance, processions, and self-flagellation. Many, however, abandoned their faith. The medieval spiritual landscape had fractured. The economy temporarily collapsed, but an unexpected phenomenon arose. The shortage of labor gave greater power to the surviving workers. Serfs began demanding better conditions, higher wages, and personal freedom. Peasants entered the market. The cities, though devastated, offered new job opportunities. This nascent balance began to destabilize the feudal system, accelerating its decline. Culturally, it was a time of wounds and rebirth. The arts reflected the anguish. In literature, images of death, judgment, and desolation emerged. Religious art adopted new symbols. The danse macabre, in engravings and paintings, depicted skeletons dancing with the living, reminding viewers of the fleeting nature of life. Meanwhile, Gothic architecture became even more intense and dramatic, with stained glass windows that seemed to filter through shadows and colors, between despair and hope. The plague was not an isolated event. It returned in waves for more than a century. Each new outbreak brought renewed fear and growing awareness of the human limits in the face of death. Quarantine practices, public health controls, and the first measures of isolation and prevention were developed. Municipal authorities implemented guards, restricted access to cities, and created sanitary regulations that, though primitive, laid the groundwork for the governance of public health in the West. In the end, the Black Death ended abruptly. Trade routes closed, populations slowly recovered, agriculture reorganized. Europe had lost millions of people, but collective memory acquired a new depth. Life, a more conscious spiritual burden. The body, a fragile asset to be protected. Death became visible, immediate, and ever-present. The history of Europe was not rebuilt in the same way afterward. The plague altered power structures. Feudal lords were left without the laborers to work their lands. Kings began to move toward more centralized rule. Cities gained weight in political negotiations, and universities, renewed after suffering heavy losses, re-emerged with a heightened awareness of human fragility. But perhaps the deepest impact was emotional. For a moment, the Middle Ages faced its rawest face. Terror, anguish, and death became daily experiences, and the attempt to turn them into a response, a collective way to face fear, marked a before and after. Europe emerged wounded but with a new awareness of its limits. It was ready for new crises, and also for new beginnings. The course of the pandemic was a ferocious blow, but also an open door. Voices regained their strength. Faces looked to the sky or the ground with the same desperate intensity. And beneath that cloak of suffering, something began to change. The next stage to emerge from those ruins would no longer be entirely medieval. A different world was about to rise. A modern world already looming on the horizon. The Western Schism and the decline of the Church. The death of Gregory XI in 1378 triggered a crisis that tore the medieval church at its very core. Until then, the papal seat had been synonymous with an almost unquestioned spiritual authority, capable of rallying entire kingdoms, declaring crusades, and excommunicating monarchs. But when the elected cardinal traveled to Rome and the other remained in Avignon, the noble papal city, unity fractured at its root. The schism would last nearly 40 years, a succession of rival popes confronting each other over their legitimacy, while European kings made quick calculations to align themselves with either the man in Rome or the one in Avignon. The result was clear. A millenary institution was collapsing under its own authority. The city of Avignon, which had housed the popes from 1270 until 1378, had become the center of a court of gold and ceremony. The pontiffs lived surrounded by luxury, embassies, art, and celebrations, while Christendom endured hunger, war, plague, and political fragmentation. When some tried to return to Rome, they found the city emptied, corrupt, and in ruins, and the Pope resumed leadership from Avignon. The Avignonese court projected an artificial splendor, with renewed habits of patronage, lavish liturgical productions, and the hiring of artists. But European nobility perceived that the Church had lost its spiritual center and had become an instrument in service of France, which controlled the pontiffs as if they were vassals. When Gregory XI returned to Rome and died shortly thereafter, the real fracture began. The College of Cardinals was divided. One group elected Urban VI, who remained in Rome. The other elected Clement VII, who took refuge in Avignon. With two competing papacies, the kingdoms responded in discord. England and Germany aligned with one, Castile, Aragon, and France with the other. Europe became a divided and fragile ecclesiastical map, where the Mass attended by a peasant might follow a different hierarchy than that of his neighbor. That papal pluralism was visible in seals, decrees, indulgences, episcopal appointments, and canons. The schism was institutional, but also symbolic. The pontificate no longer conveyed the divine word with a unified voice. The most prominent figures to emerge from this crisis were atypical men, such as Cardinal John XXIII, not the future canonized pope, or the restless Benedict XIII. They were contradictory characters, accustomed to playing between factions, weaving noble alliances, and financing military campaigns. They had entourages, based their authority on political maneuvering, and neglected the spiritual dimension of the Church. The conflict took on an almost Cold War-like tone. Diplomacy, courts, mutual excommunications, secret agreements, all beneath a veil of sacred ritual. That erosion became even more evident when, in 1415, the Council of Constance imposed itself as the arbiter of the crisis. The conclave, nearly 1,000 cardinals and bishops assembled, deposed or secured the abdication of the three rival popes and elected Martin V, who returned to Rome, nominally restoring unity. But the internal fracture was already an irreversible wound. The people had lost certainty. They had learned that the papal institution was human, contested, political. Religious authority began to depend on the king, and many monarchies strengthened their power by allying with, or confronting, the Pope. In Spain, the Reconquista was already underway, with kings controlling the Church within their territories. In France, John Lackland, disheartened by the Council of Pisa, reinforced royal authority. The Church, weakened, lost the ability to impose a uniform faith. The schism was not only an ecclesiastical problem, it was a cultural rupture. The popular disillusionment ran deep. Many clerics left the priesthood, others preached against Rome, and popular reform movements emerged. Mystical movements, such as John of Ruysbroek or Catherine of Siena, expressed a critical religiosity, less institutional. The message now passed through the conscience of the individual believer, not through obedience to Rome. The theological foundations of the following century's Reformation were already present in that unrest, in that prolonged crisis of religious identity. Although the popes maintained their architectural glory in the new St. Peter's Basilica or the splendor of pontifical orders, their prestige had been compromised. A secular consciousness had taken hold. The world was no longer governed by Rome. Saturdays and markets, cities and monarchs had grown driven by other dynamics. And the Church, inevitably, would have to transform, or cede the horizon of the future to new forms of spirituality. When Martin V died, Europe was already a different shadow than what had existed before the schism. There was a realm of committed faith that demanded purpose, not imposition; ritual, not greed; moral clarity, not empty titles. And that realm would demand a profound renewal, a reform that would come at the beginning of the next century in the form of new critical clerical movements and the great rupture known as the Protestant Reformation. The medieval Church, torn apart by the schism, had lost its center of gravity. The pillars of the old order had cracked, and Europe was preparing for a new era, a time that would require a reconfiguration of faith, authority, and identity. 100 years of war. In the middle of the 14th century, two kingdoms, England and France, became trapped in a conflict that would last for over a century. A struggle marked by vengeance, decisive battles, advances and retreats so dramatic that the war itself ended up transforming the destiny of Europe. It was a war that began with a dynastic claim, but became a stage upon which empires, royal power, and military loyalties were redefined. The spark was ignited by Edward III of England, who claimed the French throne based on a bloodline argument. He was the grandson of Philip the Fair through his mother's side, and believed that France should pass to his kingdom. The French relied on an old rule that excluded women and their descendants from the line of succession, even if that meant favoring more distant male relatives. That hereditary dispute lit a flame that engulfed both peoples in a succession of prolonged military campaigns, tense periods of peace, and internal revolts. It was a long, exhausting war that spanned entire generations. The early stages of the war favored the Kingdom of England. The famous Battle of Cressy in the year 1366 introduced a new way of fighting. English archers, armed with the fearsome longbow, shattered the French heavy cavalry with deadly precision. There was also a tactical shift. The ideal of the traditional medieval knight began to crumble, giving way to professional soldiers capable of defeating the nobility through discipline. The following year, at Poitiers, Edward the Black Prince captured King John the Good of France, deepening the humiliation. Royal ransoms reached astronomical sums, repeated symbolic humiliations that forever challenged the honor of the French monarchy. But it was not an easy victory. Despite suffering terrible defeats, France resisted. Its strength lay in its interior winds, in its people, in its lords who pledged loyalty. The figure of Charles V, known as the Wise, reorganized the war effort, reformed taxation, professionalized the armies, and consolidated the ordonnance, a kind of proto-national militia. Through that effort, he reclaimed territories and launched a counter-offensive that began to shift the balance. The war broke out in cyclical waves, a strong English phase followed by a French recovery. Edward and his descendants, strong on the islands, consolidated positions in Normandy and Aquitaine, while the French, under the leadership of Charles VII, and inspired by figures such as Joan of Arc, rekindled their morale. Yet the war remained unpredictable. There were plagues, nobles who switched sides, broken kings, and vassals who were both desperate and daring. Joan of Arc, that young peasant girl summoned by celestial voices, burst onto the scene like lightning. She reached the ears of Charles VII at a time when the fate of the kingdom hung by an almost invisible thread. She rode to the siege of Orléans and lifted it, reviving a weary army. The image of a mounted peasant woman, courageous, faithful, and determined, inspired the French. She liberated cities, brought Charles closer to his coronation at Reims, and rekindled the hope that France could rise again. Clothed in virtue, she made the English retreat before her. Joan would be captured, judged, and burned in Rouen, victim of intrigues and political machinery. But her brief appearance was enough to change the course of a war that desperately needed a miracle. France and its monarchy emerged from the war with strengthened authority. Royal centralization became more solid. National sentiment was fueled by resistance and by victories that once seemed impossible. England, by contrast, sank into internal crises. Its continental control collapsed. By the end of the conflict, King Henry VI had lost nearly all possessions in France. The English party disappeared from the continental territories it had once claimed and turned inward, toward domestic conflicts that would lead to the War of the Roses. The war deeply affected the social fabric. Cities were plundered, villages burned, and tax burdens horrified the population. There were famines, epidemics, and small rebellions. Royal finances were drained. In northern France, military fortresses were built, many of which no longer exist today, and the south became a domain of noble influence. The war was more than a conflict. It was a constant pressure on medieval society, which was redrawn under the weight of weapons and the institutions that wielded them. In European liturgy and moral life, the conflict left its mark. Failures and victories were attributed to divine will. Military rituals, specific chants, and commemorations were created. Sculptures and epic books emerged, like those of the chroniclers Froissart and Monstrelet, describing the war as a mix of farce, virtue, betrayal, and courtly love. Weapons evolved, formations changed, and although cavalry remained visible, it began to lose its central role to disciplined infantry and the use of gunpowder weaponry. The English exported to their new kingdoms a different form of feudal governance that maintained a watchful eye on the continent. The French, for their part, built a more centralized, more coherent state. During the war, the French church lost part of its power. The king rose as arbiter in matters of succession and royal legitimacy, and the modern monarchy began to emerge, with its concept of sovereignty, direct fiscal administration, and permanent armies. The feudal lordship began to weaken. Europe was changing. The 100 Years' War left behind an exhausted continent, but also one that was awakening. Borders were beginning to be defined, and peoples began to think of themselves as nations. Amidst the mud, the pain, and the treaties, something stirred deep beneath. A need to create, to rise, to seek the eternal within ruin. Europe was preparing for new words and new forms, and it was then that beauty rose in stone, and light, which until then had only filtered through small cracks, began to flood the cathedrals. Gothic art and elevated beauty. At the heart of the Middle Ages, there was a yearning to elevate more than just faith toward the heavens, a drive to build with stone, light, and proportion, a symbol that expressed humanity's tension in its search for the divine. That yearning crystallized in a new art that broke away from Romanesque darkness to rise into the heights of the world. Gothic art. Emerging in the 12th century and extending well into the 15th, Gothic was more than an architectural style. It was a way of understanding light, space, form, and mystical experience. And it forever changed the way people viewed, inhabited, and constructed the sacred. The birthplace of this art is found in the Abbey of Saint-Denis, near Paris, where Abbot Suger, writer, politician, and visionary, sought to translate spiritual light into architecture. He renovated the old church and introduced large stained glass windows that brought in luminous whiteness. Those painted windows, with deep blues and intense reds, created a stunning effect. Stone ceased to be opaque and became a mystical prism, a veil-made material through which light seemed a continuous revelation. The sensation upon entering was that of stepping into another realm, higher and more diffused than the earthly one. The radical breakthrough of Gothic art was the realization that if light could pass through, stone could become a framework, and structures could rise without weight. Thus were born the flying buttresses, the ribbed vaults, and the spires that pointed toward the sky like imploring hands. Everything in a Gothic cathedral was designed to convey an intense sensory and spiritual experience, to ascend, to contemplate, to lift the soul with the eye and the body. Over time, this style spread rapidly throughout Europe. The Cathedral of Chartres, built between the 12th and 13th centuries, is the prime example. A harmony of proportions, slender columns, intact stained glass windows, sculpted portals with scenes from the Old and New Testaments, figures of saints that seem to move on wings of stone. Chartres is not just a cathedral. It is a map of faith painted in stone and chromatic beauty. And its labyrinth, traced on the floor from the entrance to the altar, was an invitation to humility and meditative thought. In England, Gothic art adapted with new nuances. The perpendicular Gothic, with even larger windows, angular arches, and uninterrupted verticality, transformed urban churches and rural priories into places of elegant lightness. In Germany, cathedrals took on greater structural challenges. Tall, reddish columns, complex cross-shaped vaults, and realistic sculptures that emerged from facades. In Italy, Gothic art fused with classical forms, giving rise to more earthly shapes, as in Milan, Florence, and Siena, where churches featured polychrome decoration and columns crowned with fluted marble. Gothic stained glass windows were true masterpieces. They adorned the walls with biblical stories, local legends, noble emblems, and guild symbols. The light that passed through the glass opened up the interior space, dematerialized the walls, and became a divine message drawn in color. It moved the believer, made them feel like an intruder in a space that seemed alive, changing, sacred. Sculpture was another central element of Gothic art. The portals, like the Portico of Glory in the Cathedral of Santiago or the Portal of the Butchers in Burgos, were stone theaters where saints, prophets, and virtues prayed with imposing gestures, arranged in groups like silent choirs that took on a life of their own. The figures began to move, to express emotion, to show dynamism. They stretched toward life as if trying to break free from the rock. Those stones told stories of faith and social hierarchy, of ritual and imagination. But Gothic art was not limited to cathedrals. Cities became permanent workshops for this art. Town halls, market halls, private chapels, and urban cloisters. In Bruges, a grand silk exchange was built that resembled a secular temple. In Toledo, at the end of the 13th century, churches emerged that blended Mudéjar art with Gothic in a surprising cultural dialogue. In Prague, Charles IV promoted the construction of bridges, towers, and the royal cloister that echoed the soul of the new Bohemian world, with the same drive as the French cathedrals. The power of Gothic art was spiritual, aesthetic, and technological. It allowed for taller, thinner, and more luminous construction. But it had limits: construction complexity, high costs, long execution times, and technical exhaustion. Even so, its legacy endures. The elevated beauty of the Gothic continues to call to us because it speaks of a longing that transcends its era. The desire to touch the supernatural, to unite with the divine through aesthetic experience, to transform stone and shadow into a visual hymn. In many cathedrals, in stained glass windows, in rose windows, we can read the story of the Middle Ages, the faith that marched like a plague, the pestilence that shook Europe, the guilds that wove cities, the kings and monks who found in form a means of prayer. Gothic was that perfect amalgamation of faith, technology, economy, and symbol. It was elevated beauty, yes, but it was also proof of the medieval conviction that humanity could partake in the divine when structure, light, and symmetry combined in a monumental gesture. And while the Gothic spires pierced the sky, the world was turning toward new challenges: the discovery of America, the Reformation, the printing press. The brilliance of the Gothic would be pierced by another light, the light of emerging reason. But its imprint endures, carved into universal stone, remaining as a witness to a Middle Ages that aspired to lift its gaze and its heart toward the heights. Humanism knocks at the door. As the shadows of the medieval world began to scatter among Gothic cathedrals and revived libraries, a more human breeze blew from Italy. It was humanism, an intellectual movement that placed man at the center, that proclaimed the recovery of classical texts as a gateway to a new way of thinking, feeling, and creating. That wind, soft but persistent, knocked at the door of the late Middle Ages and announced that the era closing the millennium still had a chapter left to write, one where the individual, reason, and personal beauty would become pillars of a new age. Humanism did not arise in a single day, nor spring from a single workshop. It grew among circles of scholars, in the courts of enlightened princes, in urban academies, in the Italy of city-states competing for cultural prestige. Florence was one of them, wealthy from banking, powerful, and willing to invest in letters as much as in stone. Under the patronage of the Medici, the circle of Petrarch, Salutati, and Bruni was fueled by a passion for Greek and Latin classics. These men realized that medieval tradition had archived invaluable texts by Plato, Cicero, Sophocles, and Horace, hiding them beneath scholastic interpretations. They understood that to recover those ancient voices was to light a lamp over the human condition, far from strict theology and the confines of scholasticism. The figure of Petrarch marked that transition. A secular monk drawn by the passion of texts, he searched for manuscripts in abbeys, bringing Cicero into the present with the fervor of a pilgrim. It was no longer enough to preserve copies. They had to be analyzed, their virtue extracted, admired as stylistic and moral models. Humanism embraced philology, eloquence, revised history, and inspired poetry. Each recovered word was a step toward a new way of understanding writing, conversation, politics, and human dignity itself. Something changed when Lorenzo Valla, confronted with the forged donation of Constantine, demonstrated that faith could go hand in hand with critical judgment. He did not reject the Church, but he did reveal the need to assess the authenticity of its documentary foundations. It was a decisive act that showed authority could be questioned through reason, expressed with elegance, through rigorous historical study, and a passion for truth. The printing press entered the scene just as humanism sought to spread its discoveries. Gutenberg opened a radical door. Knowledge could cease to be a unique object, restricted to scriptoria, and become a product of mass reproduction. If previously the classical texts revived by philologists existed in only dozens of copies, now they could multiply, reaching the hands of citizens, students, and eager readers. Humanism found in the printing press a formidable vehicle for its message: human dignity, the ethical mandate of the thinking individual, beauty expressed through language. Not all humanism was anti-Christian. Authors such as Erasmus of Rotterdam remained faithful to their faith but reinterpreted it through education, knowledge, ethical criticism, and a renewed reading of the Gospels. Christian humanism did not repudiate faith, but hoped that faith would be accompanied by clarity, study, and sincerity. His texts promoted tolerance, critical thinking, and reform from within. Erasmus argued that a well-educated heart was more effective than a law proclaimed, that the study of the Bible could awaken a genuine desire for spiritual change. In Poland, Hungary, England, and France, academies, humanist printing houses, and classical translations were replicated. In Spain, figures like Nebrija published the Castilian grammar in the year 1492. Recognizing the native language as a valid space for intellectual creation equal to Latin. There was a new awareness that man could express himself in his own language, could name the world through his own words, and could build culture without intermediaries. It was a horizon that challenged urban, religious, and academic boundaries. It was a step toward modernity. Humanism also touched the arts. Painters such as Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael understood that color, the human body, and perspective could reproduce beauty if man was the center. Their paintings and sculptures breathed classical harmony, balance, and naturalistic observation. The human form regained its honor in face, gesture, and anatomy. Religious painting acquired intimate and expressive faces. Sculpture returned to the search for the Greek ideal. Architecture merged with the proportions of the body. This movement did not extinguish medieval roots. Universities continued teaching canon law and theology. Churches continued their spiritual functions. Town squares remained lively with the noise of growing guilds. But humanism had introduced a new tension. In that same continent of bells and cathedrals arose the idea that man was capable of self-governance, of independent thought, of exploring the world with intellectual boldness. It was the threshold of great discoveries, religious protests, and scientific revolutions. In the time when Christopher Columbus sailed into unknown waters, or Martin Luther nailed his theses in Wittenberg, Humanism had already planted a firm seed. The idea that the key to knowledge was to rescue the past in order to illuminate the present and project toward a future where freedom, reason, and beauty would become a way of life. That gentle knock that had arrived from Italy was now spreading across Europe with calm urgency. The world was changing. And as minds were being liberated, new literary genres emerged with prestige. The inner novel, the secular epic, philosophical dialogues, moral essays. Medieval Europe had become a field of cultural experimentation, a space where the written word could dialogue with sight, feeling, and doubt. And in that dialogue, the next door would open to another stage of transformation: the Reformation, the confessional conflict, and the redesign of the spiritual course of the continent. 1453, the year that changed everything. The medieval calendar marked a year that seemed routine, just another year in the lives of kings and peasants. But 1453 would become the ultimate turning point, the event that would bring the Middle Ages to an end and open the door to a different world. Two decisive events converged that year: the fall of Constantinople and the capture of Bayonne by the Portuguese. It was indeed the year that changed everything. The first rupture came in May, when the Ottoman army of Mehmed II, with modern artillery and a prolonged siege, managed to break through the ancient walls of Constantinople. For 1,000 years, the city had been the epicenter of Orthodox Christianity, the legacy of the Eastern Roman Empire, guardian of relics, codes, myths, and political power. But those walls, designed to withstand the weight of time and centuries, gave way to gunpowder and military techniques erupting from the east. When the Ottomans entered, it was no longer a historical wonder. It was an eclipse. The Hagia Sophia was transformed into a mosque. Scholars fled or were executed. Libraries were relocated or lost. Constantinople became Istanbul, now bathed in a new dawn, one that distanced itself from the medieval Christian symbolism. The Byzantine intellectuals who managed to escape before the collapse brought classical manuscripts with them to Italy, reinforcing the humanist ferment that had already begun. Works by Plato and Aristotle, many of which had survived only in Constantinople, found a new home in Florence. Those pages, filled with dialogues, logic, poetry, and ancient knowledge, accelerated the cultural and philosophical momentum of the Renaissance. What was a political defeat became a spiritual triumph for those seeking to rediscover the voices of the classical past, an invisible legacy that altered the intellectual geography of Europe. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, the capture of Bayonne by the Portuguese in that same year of 1453 meant something different, yet equally symbolic. It confirmed that maritime routes were destined to become the new frontier. With control over that port city, Portugal solidified its thrust toward the Atlantic, sailing toward Ceuta, toward the future of exploration and trade. An empire was beginning to take shape, one no longer based on feudal domains or omnipresent kings, but on sails, compasses, treaties, and commercial daring. The age of discovery was rising just as the Byzantine walls were falling. The impact was immediate. Geopolitics were rewritten. The Mediterranean was no longer an exclusively Christian sea. Emerging powers began to reorganize. Venice and Genoa feared for their trade routes. Castile and Aragon adjusted their diplomacy, and the papacy, still entangled in near-feudal orders, began to sense that the center of gravity was shifting toward new realms and temporal powers. On the religious front, the Ottoman advance marked a spiritual threshold. The Christian world lost its historic stronghold. The Orthodox Church was subdued or co-opted, and the Western papacy looked on with concern as Christendom shrank territorially. The rhetoric of holy wars intensified, crusades of words and ideological clashes with Muslims, but at the same time, a moment of introspection arose. If those mighty walls had fallen, what was happening to religious power in the West? Calls for reform in the clergy, for moral integrity, for clear and authentic spiritual authority became more urgent. Culturally, 1453 was also an aesthetic turning point. The Gothic forms that had dominated the European landscape began to merge with the classical clarity brought by the Greek manuscripts. Architecture, sculpture, and painting gained new vision. Classical proportions fused with Gothic verticality. Religious themes were enriched with individual portraits, naturalistic perspective, attention to the body and to human emotion. The Renaissance was a symbiosis, the ancient and the modern looking together toward the future. Economically, the Atlantic expansion triggered the rise of early commercial capitalism. Tin mines, transoceanic exchanges, routes toward Africa and the Americas began to reshape the wealth of entire kingdoms. Merchant cities regained prominence. Traders, bankers, guild houses, and the spice trade built the scaffolding of what would become economic modernity. Politically, 1453 marked the consolidation of territorial sovereignty. States ceased to be fragmented feudal conglomerates. Prussia, Castile, France, England, Portugal emerged as entities with centralized administration, tariffs, paid armies, and permanent diplomacy. The medieval feudal world was fading. The professional monarchy, the modern state, were born at the very moment the Byzantine Empire fell and global trade routes opened. And on a human level, for those who lived through that year, it was a borderland experience. Their gaze turned watchful and uncertain. There was a need for adaptation, for reinvention. The world's channels shifted, from Greece to Portugal, from Istanbul to Lisbon. Maps stopped being rough sketches and became instruments of navigation and promises of wealth, knowledge, and expansion. 1453 was indeed the year that changed everything. The Middle Ages came to a close in that blood-soaked, fire-filled, word-laden moment. And Europe prepared for a journey that still defines our civilization today. The search for new lands, the questioning of religion, the affirmation of culture, and the construction of a more global world. A millennial cycle ended. Another began, one flooded with the printing press, colonial empires, reform, and reason. And the echo of that transformation still resonates in every Gothic stone, in every classical text, in every port where nets rise over the sea. A grand final chapter for the medieval age. And thus, we reach the end of this journey through the Middle Ages. Centuries of wars, prayers, castles, plagues, and paths that shape the world we now inhabit. A time when humanity sought God and slowly began to find itself. If this story kept you company tonight, if an image or a detail sparked your curiosity, I invite you to leave a comment. What part surprised you the most? What topic would you like to explore in another tale? And if you enjoy these journeys through time, told calmly and with passion, feel free to subscribe to the channel. There are still many stories waiting to be unearthed. Thank you for being there. Turn off the light, close your eyes, and let history continue in your dreams. Good night.